Right. Okay. I've been given the nod. So, we right? Yeah. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Great to be first up here in the grass tent at Groundswell. I guess the aim of this session is to sort of facilitate the exchange of different experiences of implementing agroforestry. So I'm joined up here by two farmers that have recently planted agroforestry and are keen to share all the good, the bad, the ugly, maybe. Okay, so I'll briefly introduce myself, though it's very much not about me. It's about these two guys, just remember that. And my name's John Haines. I'm the Agroforestry Advisor at the Soil Association. So I work within the farming and land use team within the charity section of the Soil Association. And I support, I guess my role is mainly to support and advise farmers at maximising sort of the benefit of integrating trees within their farms. So obviously you've got the headline agroforestry systems that are put in, but it's also to work with other people in our agroforestry team around woodland, making the most of on-farm woodland, and hedgerow trees and parkland trees and things like that. So it's a really broad subject, and I really love farming, but I also really love trees. So it brings it all together, really, for me. So reach out, connect with me. I will be, for the rest of Groundswell, I'll be loitering around the Soil Association tent. So come and find me, ask me questions, whatever. Good to speak to people and connect. So that's that done. I'm going to introduce David Brewer here, who's a farmer from Exmoor. Well, and Alex Fraser, a farmer from Yorkshire. I'll introduce them. I'll let them introduce themselves and their farm properly, I think, shortly. So before we do that, does that work? Right. The plan for the session, as I said, Alex and David will introduce themselves, their farms, and their agroforestry systems. You know, their aims, their hopes, their dreams. And then they will each take turns talking around sort of three key stages. So the planning and design, their planting experience of actually getting the trees in the ground, how hard was it, and then ongoing maintenance, future plans for the systems and for harvests and things like that. And the idea is, hopefully, we will have 10-15 minutes at the end to answer any questions. So that's the plan. I'll give the floor to David, and he will talk about his farm and his agroforestry system.
Cool. Thanks, John. So we farm down on the edge of Exmoor. My wife and I took over the farm about 2 years ago after like a 10-year kind of handing over process. And the farm's been in my family for best part of 300 years. So kind of a lot of heritage and stuff that goes with it. We've got 450 acres and we're sort of very mixed. So it breaks out sort of 150 acres of permanent pasture. We're all organic and kind of regenerative. I'm kind of whether we should use the term or not, but that's, you know, we kind of are fully invested in that model of farming. So we've got 150 acres of permanent pasture, 150 acres of alley cropped arable, not all of which is planted, but most of it is in kind of design. And then we also have 150 acres of woodland and woodland creation. And our view of the farm is that we farm for nature and then grow our crops in the bits that nature doesn't need as much. And that's kind of very much what we want to do. And for us, that trees on the farm is like the starting point for that. And so we just look at the farm and say, how many trees can we get in it and how can they benefit us? Also, part of our model is that we want to showcase that you can be a mixed kind of medium to small size farm and still be profitable and not have to worry about the bank manager and the inputs and all that side of it, because that's where this transition for us came from, because we were kind of on the horrible sort of arable kind of financing crops for next year before you even sold the current crops and stuff like that. So we sort of had an epiphany and said we're just going to stop, and so we just literally literally stopped it. And then the agroforestry thing, we sort of looked at it, and so now we've planted up. We've probably planted 60 acres of nuts, so walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts. Mainly on an arable land, some on permanent pasture, but all apart from the chestnuts that are in a more of a sort of traditional orchard. But the rest of it is all planted on 32-metre rows. And we have, I'll go into a bit more detail later, but we have also used mid-tier country stewardship quite a lot to buffer the trees that we've planted. So that's sort of a summary of the farm. We also got a Red Devon suckler herd as well, and they go everywhere on the farm. So if we don't have any winter crop in, then they are on the land, on the cropping land all winter, and we don't house them. So yeah, it was last winter was okay, but everyone says in the southwest you can't outwinter cattle. Well, you can, but you have to be quite organised and you have to accept mistakes. That's kind of the thing I'd say. So should I hand over?
Yeah, sure. So hi, can you hear me? I'm Alex. I'm an organic arable farmer based up in Yorkshire, sort of just south of Leeds, near Huddersfield. And we've been farming for 5 years now. So one of the first things that we did was put the land through organic conversion, and we're farming about 100 hectares. We've just taken on a little bit more land as well. We've got 100 hectares in organic rotational cereals. We're on a clay loam soil, so it can get sort of quite wet, you know, in winter times. And yeah, sort of our typical rotation comprises essentially of a 2-year red clover lay, and then we turn that over and then aim to grow 3 years of cereal crops in that. That is sort of constantly changing, but that's been our model kind of to date. We are farming principally to produce food. We perceive that as our main role as farmers, and we're trying to produce that food in a way that's regenerative. And we're trying to ultimately produce high-quality milling-grade cereals that can be milled, distributed, and eaten as locally as possible. And we're trying to do all of that in the context of, you know, improving our soil health, hopefully drawing down some carbon out of the atmosphere, doing so in a way that financially stacks up. So, as I say, we're early days. We're 5 years in. And we sort of realised, you know, through the farm and through our sort of experiences farming to date, that some of the land is fairly exposed. You know, our sort of highest fields are about 780 feet above sea level. And we get quite a lot of rain. We get about 1 metre of rain a year. And as I said earlier, we're on some sort of clay, loamy soils that can get a bit wet and a bit sticky. So taking all that in mind, we really thought that integrating trees on the farm would be of a huge benefit. You know, that would help to alleviate some of the sort of drainage issues in the fields over winter, help to dry out the land when it's wet, but equally when it's really hot, aim to hold on to more moisture and reduce the evapotranspiration that we're losing from the fields, and generally create just a nicer environment for crops to grow within. We'd also like to sort of boost the fungal elements around the trees and hope that those interactions can then benefit the crops, probably nearest the tree rows first, but then migrating out from those strips in towards the crops. And it seemed a good opportunity to really integrate some pest management on the farm. This was one of our biggest fields. It's about 50 acres. And it was a really good opportunity to put trees in, to put wildflowers under those trees that already is absolutely alive with, you know, ladybirds, pollinators, birds, and because that sits fairly centrally within the farm, we're hoping that that'll be of a real benefit in the future. So taking all those things in mind, obviously we could have chosen from a variety of different agroforestry systems, but the one that we went for is a coppicing hardwood system. So the aim is to produce hardwood trees that will be coppiced on a 10 to 15 year cycle for the most part, and that will stop them interfering with the arable side of things, which remains our main priority, but actually enhance that arable environment. So we can talk a little bit more on the trees perhaps later.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, David. Okay, so we'll move into the sort of first element, which is sort of the planning and design behind your agroforestry systems. So, for context, how did you plan? How did you design? How long did it take you? Did you consult anyone? Those sorts of things, I guess. Yeah, go for it, David.
So we had in our minds for a long time that we wanted to plant some agroforestry alleys, and because it looked cool, and I just love the photos of like combines coming up the lines in France, and I just think there's, when you're kind of pushing these lines of trees into your arable fields, you're just giving the amazing corridors for the wildlife and for insect, and as Alex was saying, you're just helping yourself by kind of allowing nature into your fields, rather driving on the way up and you just look to the side and you think, Jesus, how big is that field? And you're like, where are the hedges? Where are the trees? And we need them if we're going to farm sustainably to help us, because we can't do it. Man-made inputs won't be able to do it. So we knew we wanted to do it, and then we looked at, well, what can we do? And we're sort of marginal arable farmers, I would say. We're certainly not, not grade 1 land by any stretch. And so we're like, well, how can we make the system work for us? And as from the photo there, you can see we've got quite a mature hedge network already. That's because we've got a knackered hedge trimmer, basically. And I don't like burning diesel, although farmers seem to love burning diesel, and I just don't get it. So we sort of looked at the hedge network, and because we're in the national park, we spoke to them, and they were doing their landscape recovery kind of plan, and they were talking about connecting landscapes and connecting pockets of woodland. And so we were like, okay, well, this seems to be the answer. And so we did a bit of research, listened to a few podcasts. We consulted with FWAG Southwest as well about what we could do. And we also worked with Riverford for our trees as well. They handily supplied some of the trees and advice on guarding and planting and stuff. But ultimately, I remember listening to one podcast, and it was like, the problem with agroforestry is you've got to plan so much because it's so detailed and you have to really get your planning right. But I'm just like, just get out and plant it. Like, as long as you've done a bit of due diligence, just get out, plant it. Because once the trees are in the ground, at least they're growing. We know we've got 5 years before we're going to get anything off them at all. So in terms of the detail of what we did, so the photo you can see here is more of the pasture side, although the greener field is a herbal ley. So we have hopefully 2 years herbal ley and then 3 years of arable rotation. So you can see the lines that we've planted there. So as I said, we're 32 metres apart, and on the other half of the farm that we've planted, we've included basically a metre for the tree, and then 3 metres either side we've put into a mid-tier stewardship option. And that's AB8. And we chose that one, which is, check what it's called, flower-rich margins. And we chose that because it allowed us to top it if we needed to just before harvesting the nuts. So it allowed us to get onto it and do something, but it meant it was one that we didn't need to re-sow every year. We could leave it. And the hectare rate on that one, I just checked this morning, is about 267 a hectare for payments on that. And so that was kind of, we thought, well, let's do that because it will give us a bit of a cash flow kind of buffer going through until the trees are actually producing some nuts. So then when we came to plant, we drew it all online just using some of the kind of free farm software, and sort of said, yeah, this looks about right. Someone told us once that 24 metres was all a squirrel was prepared to run in open space. So like the ends are 24 metres to the hedge. I'm pretty sure it's absolute rubbish. But I reckon you could get a squirrel in a 24-metre run if we're looking to reduce their numbers. So it also felt about right for turning on the headlands. So the field in the foreground that you can see that we haven't quite planted yet, the stakes are just on the floor. That will be made as hay as well, and the cattle will graze it. So it felt like, we're giving ourselves enough space to kind of get sensible machinery around and use it. So that's what we did, and then we marked everything out with a big tape measure and some fencing stakes, which in hindsight might not be the most sensible, because it does mean your 3 meters can, if you're going down with a 3 meter drill, sometimes you've got a bit of short work to do. But maybe GPS would have been better. But I kind of like the field that's got the curve of trees. I like the way it follows the hedge. I think it just looks a bit more aesthetic. And I don't think we'd have done that if we'd have planned it on GPS and just gone out and drilled it, planted it. So we ran a single leg subsoiler down the row of the trees, and then we planted into that slot. There was a lot of debate whether you plant into or next to, or whether you're creating issues with drainage and voles running down the line. But for us, we had quite a lot of volunteers planting, and actually just to have a line that the volunteers. Well, I guess wrap up.
No, you're jumping ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Oh, designing and planning. Yeah, true. So that's kind of where we planned and designed, and then we, because we were working with Riverford, we had the kind of walnuts and hazelnuts, and so the sort of pollination was a thing that we had to consider as well, and so make sure you've got the right pollinating trees in the right, know where your prevailing wind is, and that you put your right pollinating trees in the right area.
Yeah, great. I just saw the rest of the talk disappearing. Okay. Same question, I guess. How did you approach planning? How long did it take? Who did you talk to? That sort of thing. Good.
Yeah. So from a planning side, we're an arable farm, so we very much wanted a system that would work in an arable context. We always viewed the agroforestry as a system that's going to complement the cereals rather than sort of taking an area out of production for something else. So that was always a real main sort of aim. We really wanted to factor that into the design. When we decided that we wanted some strips of trees in the field, because we thought that would work best in a cereal context, we sort of landed on the alley cropping design, which is essentially an alley of trees, which are pretty much where the posts are on the photo on the right. And that sits above a sort of grassy, wildflowery mix that's 6 meters wide. And then adjacent to that, we've got a 24-meter cereal cropping alley. And the thinking is there that'll be pretty much future-proof to any different sizes of equipment that we choose to run through to do the cultivating on the arable side. So once we decided on the kind of overall layout, we obviously had to choose what trees to put in the ground. And for us, we landed on the coppicing system because we weren't confident that fruit trees or nut trees would necessarily work from an exposure point of view and from a wind point of view, and just from a sort of timing of harvest. And in many ways, we also wanted to create a system which was had minimal amounts of input and ongoing cost to actually derive the benefits of this kind of agroforestry microenvironment that we were seeking to create. So we decided on hazel trees, which are going to be coppiced on a 4-year cycle. And then we've also got alders, we've got sycamores, and we've got sweet chestnuts in different proportions. Each of which we think has a useful role to play individually. The hazels will give us a bit of an earlier harvest. The alders themselves are actually nitrogen fixing, which we thought was kind of interesting from an organic land management point of view. It didn't seem a bad idea to have a few more nitrogen fixing things around. And the other trees like sweet chestnut, sycamore make fantastic fencing posts, and if nothing else, they all make fantastic wood chip, and we can use that across a multitude of different ways on the farm. So essentially we started off by installing the strips. So we did that in September a couple of years ago. Dissed the land, drilled the land, got those established. And what that meant is that we could mow those for a year, essentially, before establishing the trees into those, and then they were a bit easier to travel on and to work with during the tree planting process. So we made them 6 meters wide, so that hopefully when the trees grow from where those posts are on the photo, even when they're coppice, they're not growing out the ways too much and interfering with the arable equipment. And we, in terms of the sort of tree spacings, this was all kind of tricky to work out, really, because there's not a lot of evidence, not a lot of research that's gone into a coppicing hardwood alley cropping system. There's a lot of older kind of literature about how to manage coppicing woodlands, but that didn't really fit in an alley cropping setting because the light availability is so different. So a lot of it actually depended on what the post looked like in the ground, and that was the day we went out and said, does that look right? Do we think we'll be able to harvest that? And do we think that's going to interfere with the machinery? And I hope that it doesn't. So once we had the strips established and we decided on the distances, we marked out the lines of the rows because we knew at this point that we wanted to get volunteers in to plant the trees. And we thought trying to maintain a straight line was going to be challenging. So we essentially got an electric fencing reel and just laid that out along the strips and then marked on the ground where the posts would go. And then somebody else came in and put a post in essentially where the marks were on the ground. That was quite time consuming. Arguably if I had the time, you would do the post at the same time as you're marking it. But we were just quite time pressed at that time of year, and it made sense for somebody else to put the posts in. And then the sort of the design of the trees is that there's a double row, and the trees are kind of offset between those rows. So there's 1.5 meters between lines of trees, and then between the individual trees within the rows, you walk past them, there's about 3 meters. So it works out at about a 2 meter tree center. And that's a bit tighter than a traditional woodland coppice, but I think we can get away with that increased intensity because there's a lot more light availability. So we'll see how that pans out. The rows themselves are north-south orientation, so there's a better shade profile, and you don't have a northern side to the strip that's constantly going to be shaded. And yeah, I think that's about all with planning, really.
Thank you. Okay, to move on to then planting, I guess. When, what time of year, how, who, and how did you convince them? Those sorts of things. Hand over to David.
So we, one thing I should say is that because we're quite steep in a lot of our land, we favoured planting cross contour or with contour across the slope, just to reduce runoff and try and keep the soil in the field rather than running down the lane. So that sort of gave us our orientation, which meant that it wasn't ideal necessarily all the time for daylight and the sun. And we are aware that with the walnuts, if we allow them to get too big, then we could see some issues later on with shading. But I think we'll just see how it goes and see what happens. We planted at 5 meter spacings for the walnuts, which is close. But the plan is that so we should see some nuts roughly at about 5 years, and we should be able to maintain the 5 meter spacing hopefully till about 10 years. So, and then at 10 years we'll take out, some will fail, but at 10 years we'll take out every other one to open up the space for the kind of better trees that we've got. And purely we were lucky enough to have the trees available, so we did it, and it meant that we will get better return, obviously, for the 5 to 10 year period. So when we were actually planting, as I say, we ran a single leg subsoiler down the lines we were going to plant. Then we started off banging stakes in manually. When I say started, we did about half an hour, and then I went on Amazon. I was like, we're going to buy a petrol popper. I'm not doing this. And so we had two. They were probably 8-foot stakes that we banged in either side of the subsoiled line. The tree got planted in the middle, and then there was a plastic guard with a small stake just to stop the voles and stuff. Plastic is like the worst thing for us, and at the time we couldn't get any alternatives. We've tried cardboard. We put a hedge in as well with cardboard guards, and they're just all over the field now. It's one of our other things is to try and be kind of zero plastic, and that's challenging at the minute. I think we're about 6 months to a year away from having something that's like really commercially viable. Because a lot of anyway, it's a big kind of bugbear of mine. So we did have to use some plastic guards, and then we put a cactus guard over the top. If no one knows what a cactus guard, anyone who's heard of a cactus guard will know they're horrible spiky things. They seem to be taking the market by storm at the minute. They're really expensive, but they're really good. And they come as a flat sheet. It's almost like weld mesh that's been punched out to be as sharp as it can be. And you roll it round, and then the cactus that guard goes over the two stakes and fully protects the tree. So before, we weren't in our mid-tier option here, so we didn't have any requirements as to what we could do around the trees. So last winter we grazed right up to the tree. We mob grazed the cattle through winter cover crop that we'd planted into the arable, and we just we effectively ran a fence line one side of all the guards and had the cows run one side and then just turn them around, didn't move the fence, and then they could run right up to the tree. And we haven't had the cows push one tree over. We've had a few operator errors with tractors and drills and equipment like that. And like looking at the end of the line, like, Dad, that tree was straight. It was like, yeah, I might have had an accident with that one. But yeah, so the cactus guards are, if you can afford them, are really, really good, and they stop anything getting to the tree. We also have a healthy deer population on the farm, which is good. So we needed to stop them as well, and so that was why we put the cactus guards in, because at that time we didn't have any other deer control really in place. The other plastic kind of hideousness is the tree tie. We tried jute, and we tried to do jute and nail, and it was just a pain. Absolutely, because the bands of jute are quite thick and they're not very easy to use, whereas these plastic kind of chain lock ones are just so easy to use. So at the minute, that's what we're kind of using. I don't see any reason why they can't be made of chemical based plastic, but hopefully that'll happen. So when we actually put, most of our trees were bare root, and so we just dug a hole. We put some well-rotted farmyard manure in the bottom of the hole because we had it. We used some kind of off-the-shelf mycorrhizal powder. I'm not sure it helped really. I think so. An aside to that is we planted a hedge, and I planted half of it with it and half of it without, and I can't tell the difference. And it was expensive. So I think we're better off if I was going to do it again, I'd go and try and make our own, kind of with the capturing bacteria and stuff from the air, and going into our existing woodlands and trying to get some of the fungal spores from there. So and then planted the bare roots into the slot, healed them in as well as we could, and then we mulched with municipal compost. Our local council depot had quite a good batch of with very, very little plastic in it. That's the biggest issue I think that a lot of people have had with municipal compost, is that you just end up getting lots of little bits of plastic. We were lucky we didn't get that much. There's still some, and going forward we won't use it. It was more just for year one that we put a bit of sort of feed with the tree. And then we'll wood chip from now on, because part of our woodland creation will create a lot of wood chip as well. So that's what we'll do in terms of weed suppression going forward. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Go for it.
Thank you. So yeah, in terms of our planting experience, it was fantastic really overall, I have to say. We made an event on Eventbrite, which I'd never used before. And then we publicised that through sort of social media, and it got a sort of modest amount of interest, and then some people told other people, and we actually ended up with 80 volunteers coming over 4 days to come and help us out with the trees, which we were really happy with, because we've got about 3,500 trees in the system. So we sort of figured quite early on that would be a bit too much to just get immediate family and friends to be doing. So yeah, we made this event. We planted one weekend in early January this year and one weekend in early February. We deliberately made them a bit apart so that if we had a real shocking weather window or the ground was just frozen for a period of time, then we at least had some sort of backup coming a month later. And yeah, we sort of comfortably got all the trees in the ground over that 4-day period, and that was with people planting trees for the first time ever. Lots of children and families coming out for a day out really. So that was really nice, and it was a good excuse to get people out onto the farm and to have a bit of a conversation with them about farming and organic farming and regen, and so that was really positive. In terms of the kind of on the day practicalities, we'd got the posts in the ground to sort of mark out the spacings and the lines already. And we bought a handful of tree spears, which are essentially a narrow, pointy, flat spade, but a lot easier than using a spade for actually getting trees in the ground, because they were just little bare root plants. So there wasn't a lot to really put underground, in fact barely anything with some of the trees. So we sort of taught the volunteers how to do that, and then we planted at a phenomenal rate. We were just making essentially a wedge in the soil, putting the tree in and healing it in. Then we were quite fortunate, actually, I should have said earlier, that the Woodland Trust actually provided us with the trees, the stakes and the guards. And we're taking part in a tree guard trial for them. So we've got a few plastic guards as a control, and then the other guards that we've got are meant to be fully biodegradable. And in what time period, we're not sure. Too soon or too long, remains to be seen. And then, yeah, we managed to get all of the trees with a guard on, cable tied onto a stake, and managed to put a sort of a good amount of wood chip around each one as well. So that was how we did our mulching. And so far, that seems to be doing quite a good job of suppressing the grass and the wildflower mix that we'd established the year before, just to give the roots in the tree a decent chance to actually have enough water and enough nutrients and enough of their own soil to establish themselves. Whether or not we need to revisit that remains to be seen, really. It's not a graded wood chip. It's just a sort of woodland mulch that's come from a tree surgeon, so I think it will degrade faster than a pure kind of wood chip mix. But that mulching, probably helps the trees to get off to a good start as well. Yeah, we kept the volunteers well fed, well watered. We did a nice lunch, lots of cake, lots of tea, lots of coffee. But yeah, overall the days worked really well, and we ended up planting essentially 800 trees a day. And I don't have an exact figure yet on failings and how many might not make it through the year, but we've walked up a few of the rows. And I think 10% is probably a reasonable figure that I'm kind of optimistically hoping for, which, considering they were planted pretty quickly by first-time planters, is pretty good, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. That's interesting. So next and lastly, I guess, talking about maintenance. So what maintenance are you doing on the trees? I guess how often are you looking at them? And other sort of routine things that you need to do to support the trees and the system. If you want to have a go.
So as I said, the first mulch we did was municipal compost, and then we plan to mulch the trees every year with wood chip. The reason for that is I don't want to do too much mowing between them. It goes back to burning red diesel again. And I think if we can keep a really good mulch, so here you can see this is basically grown in the middle of our winter cover crop. So this is before the cows came in and grazed it all. And so that's the kind of, we'll be putting on probably 10 big shovelfuls of mulch on every tree. And we've got 1,000 in the ground at the minute, and we've got the system set up to plant another 3,000. So I'm aware it's going to be quite a bit of mulching, and it might move, after the first sort of 3-4 years, we might end up saying, well, actually, we don't need to do as much now. But the plan is to mulch. I think we have also been kind of we're more conscious of the mulching because we planted last winter. Was it last winter? Yeah, last winter, and we had a pretty dry spring, if anyone remembers. So when we planted, we were like, should we irrigate? Should we be putting irrigation in? And as a farm, we don't even have a water system for the cattle. So we're lugging that around and trying to mob graze cattle through. So we're like, there's no way we're going to be irrigating these trees. And then there's the whole argument as if you do irrigate them, do you make them dependent on the water? And so we were like, no, let's go tough love. See you in the summer, trees. And the walnuts did really well. They were bigger trees. I think, look, it feels like the species and variety were the kind of the good and the bad for us, but I think it was more probably about the actual trees that we had. The walnuts were bigger trees, although they were bare root. The hazels we had were quite small, and I reckon we're probably at maybe 50-60% losses on those. I also think they went into quite a we're sort of shillity soil, and I think they just didn't get the moisture. Whereas the walnuts were a bit bigger, and probably the planting time helped as well, because our planting was a lot more drawn out, which, just going back to that, was good for us, because if we'd have had 80 people arrive, we'd have looked like it would been an absolute disaster on day one. It took us like probably half a day to plant the first tree until you realise what you're doing and figuring it all out. So I think definitely doing some like demo planting, or what are we going to do if you're going to have a big planting day. You've got to have all your ducks in a line. You need 20 or 30 spades and things like that. So it's that's kind of a key thing if you're going to try and plant a lot quickly. So in terms of maintenance, then we haven't really started too much pruning yet at all. We try and look at the trees and kind of give them a rough health score every year, just to get around them and see what they're doing. It's not so much what we can do for the tree; it's more what the tree can show us it's doing, and kind of just look at it and see how it's reacting and which ones are doing better in which parts of the farm, because that's really interesting for us. And I think a tree's going to give you longer to kind of give you some information about your farm and the soil type and how you're doing. So I think for us to learn from them is as important. When we do come to prune, we will be, the plan is to shake and catch when we harvest. So we do need to make sure we're pruning a nice clear stem so we can actually get a shaker onto it, and then an umbrella under the tree, or kind of undecided as to whether it's an umbrella or whether we sort of just hoover them up. But that's the plan for harvest. So we will need to prune them, thinking about that, to make sure we get at least sort of 4 or 5 foot of stem or trunk before we allow the tree to crown out too much. And irrigation, like we kind of swing to and fro, and it's only a bit of pipe. Alkathene's quite cheap at the minute. It's kind of, you think we could just run, it's less than £1 a metre. We could run some in and it's going to save. But with the hazelnuts, you're like, yep, definitely the right thing to do. Walnuts, well, it wouldn't have been worth it in the long run, looking at it now, because they're all well established and looking really good now. So it's, I think if you've got the infrastructure there to do it easily, then it might be worth doing. But otherwise, I think it's probably just ride out the losses if you have a kind of particularly dry spring. That's about it.
I guess just before we hand over, worth saying, talked about the time it took for you to plant a tree, if that makes sense. That was really interesting, I thought.
So yeah, so we had to work out the costing, or we wanted to work out the costings, and in terms of time per tree, I think we ended up adding up all our hours and dividing it by the number of trees, and it worked out at about half an hour a tree, even when we were going quickly. But that's from driving. That's from walking into the field to measure the tree, to measure where you're going to plant the tree, subsoiling, planting, stakes, guarding, building the guard, mulching, and then leaving the field. So it was, you did a mega job. So, but I think the extra guarding that we put on is a lot of the time.
Yeah. So in terms of our kind of ongoing maintenance, really our trees are pretty much all set now for the first 5 years. At which point we'll take the guards off, chop them down to their base, which will feel a bit scary, I'm sure, to sort of encourage them to coppice. And then the hazels will be harvested on a 4-year cycle, and they've been planted in a double row, so it's hazel next to hazel, so it'll be kind of a 2-year sort of pattern. So we'll always retain those kind of agroforestry benefits in the field. And then the other trees are probably going to take realistically about 10 to 15 years potentially before we actually get a harvest out of those. By which point we're aiming for hopefully 4 or 5 kind of main stems coming from each base, and then we'll be able to cut those down and then use them as wood chip or as posts or whatever we have a use for on the farm. So we may need to remulch. It really just depends on the kind of pressure from the grasses that we're getting and the wildflowers creeping in. So far so good, but it's early days. The last trees were only planted in February this year, so it might be that we have to go around and remulch those, which will be a big job. There's a lot of trees, and you can see in the photo on the left how he did that was essentially driving a small tractor and trailer. Pretty much managed to get onto the strip, which was nice. We weren't in the arable field too much when it was wet, and shoveled the best part of 2 Arctic loads of wood chip into trugs, and then heaped the trugs onto the trees. So that will be a bit of a job if we have to redo that again. I'm hoping that we might not have to. And I think from our point of view, our trees are a relatively lower value. They've been a lot cheaper to get in the ground, and we can sort of touch on that later. So I'm maybe less worried about losing the odd one than if they were an expensive chestnut or a walnut tree. So that's the sort of tree side, and then we're going to maintain the strips every year. We'd like to keep seeing the wildflowers in there. They've got an absolutely fantastic display of oxeye daisies at the moment, and we've got about 10 other perennial wildflowers to sort of flower in succession through the year. And we don't want the grasses to swamp those out, even though they are slow-growing, sort of older grasses. So every year we'll end up cutting the grass, essentially where the trailer is sat on that photo. Our current thoughts are to do that and sort of pile it up almost like with a silage cutter mower rather than a flail mower, and then probably let it dry out. Aim for a bit of seed shed and seed ripening, and then go through, bale all of that off. Almost manage it a bit like a hay meadow to try and get that seed return and not make the grasses too competitive. So every year we'll have to. There are 20 strips throughout the field. And if you put them all one end on the other, it's about 3.5 kilometres to drive. So if you're going up and down, that's kind of a 7-kilometre line to be going out and mowing and baling. But I think that's manageable. So we'll sort of maintain the strips that way. And we'll also run essentially a subsoiler leg along the edge of where the grass meets the arable crop. And what that will do is it'll mean that the trees won't be growing out superficially into the sort of same root zone as the cereal, and it'll force them to go down and deeper, and sort of, and improve the soil, at that depth, but also act as like a massive drainage channel in the field that's great at, absorbing excess moisture and transpiring that through the system. There are some fantastic photos of poplar trees in France where they've done this, and you can really clearly see where they've root pruned. The whole rooting structure is so different, and it sort of forces the tree to then go down, which will hopefully then mean that these stools will be really resilient in the long run because they'll have really deep root structures. So all of that, is a kind of annual maintenance in terms of the strips and the root pruning. And in terms of harvesting, we're going to be doing all of that with a chainsaw. When we first looked into the coppicing systems, if you had a big coppicing system, you could probably get a machine like a forager in to sort of blow, chip it and put it straight in a trailer. But we're not wanting to trample all over the fields when they're wet, in the middle of winter when we're going to be harvesting the trees. So heavy equipment is a bit of a no-go. So we'll end up taking that off, essentially probably in a quad bike and a trailer. And coming back to my previous point, it's in many ways we're trying to create this ecosystem that's really beneficial for the farm, and all of this timber is essentially going to be an extra and a bonus and a byproduct. So we weren't looking to be in there harvesting a lot because that's our biggest cost. So the least amount of harvesting we can do actually makes the whole system a lot more cost effective for the benefits that it's going to bring. We might need to do the odd pruning of any straggly branches that are coming out into the arable strips, just so we're not interfering with farm machinery. And yeah, that's the sort of the bulk really of the maintenance. Coming back to the time point, I think we sort of added up all of the volunteer hours, the initial cultivations and seeding and mowing, mulching. We didn't quite manage to finish the mulching with the volunteers, so that was quite a lot of family time finishing all that off. And we reckon it's about 13 minutes per tree in our case. But they didn't go in the ground with anywhere as much sort of care as David's trees. They were very much, quickly in, heal them in and sort of move on. But the cost of our trees is a lot lower. I sort of added up the numbers last week, and I think to get to where we've got to now, even if we ignore all the funding that we've got, and we did get a lot of funding, probably costs about £5.70 per tree. So that's not with my time fully accounted for, or the volunteers' time paid for, or family's time paid for. But in terms of the direct sort of cost of actually getting it in the ground, getting it mulched, buying the chips, and as it happens, we were really heavily subsidised by the Woodland Trust, which was fantastic. So it sort of worked out at £2.60 per tree to get to a system where the trees are in the ground, they're mulched, and the strips are in and flowering and looking amazing. Yeah.
Ours are a bit more expensive than that. I think ours are probably, depending on how you do the labour, anywhere from 60 to 80 quid a tree, with the tree, the guard, and the time.
So we'll open up the floor for questions, but while we do that, I guess if sort of pre-prepared, but suggest one line or a quick soundbite for advice for other farmers that are considering doing this.
Mine is just get on with it.
Mine is, I think, just really consider all of the benefits of the system. There are some that are financial and really tangible, and you can have an output and put a cost against. But there's so much more, natural capital, drainage, just looking amazing and being a field that you walk past every day. I think there's so many immeasurable benefits to putting this in. Sort of consider all of those, when you're putting your system in.
Okay, are there any questions? While the mics, yeah, go for it.
Fantastic. Good morning. Really interesting. Have you, or do you plan to do any assessments in terms of carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so sort of untold story here. So
that's why we're here.
Yeah, I deal with a lot of farmers, obviously, that have implemented agroforestry. And one of the projects that we're working on, alongside lots of other project partners, is the Agroforestry Carbon Code. So we're currently looking at, we've got six pilots in England and 2 up in Scotland, and we're sort of trying to measure, trying to explore the feasibility of a code that could pay farmers for their carbon that's stored in sort of above ground biomass of the trees. that sort of the project comes to the end in August, and so we're exploring it. It's on the cards. Next one. Go for it. Yeah, if you see a hand.
Okay.
A question for David. What is your target market for your walnuts, and where did you source the trees from?
So as I alluded to, we worked with Riverford for them. So Riverford had already sourced the trees, and the target market is that we're in discussions with Riverford at the minute as to whether they're going to put together, because they've also planted some trees in a with the same system as us. So I think probably we'll pull them all together and sell them through their online kind of system, because at the minute they buy in walnuts and stuff from abroad. As nuts at the minute, yeah. Although I did have some really delicious green like pickled walnuts the other day. So I think for us as a farm, what we want to do is one of the drivers is I don't want any lorries coming in bringing stuff in, so like fertilizers, anything like that, and all the lorries that leave need to be taking the highest value out. So it's something that we'll definitely look at, and I think through all the other bits of the farm, because we're quite a small farm, we need to make the most of all our, we've got a small amount of wheat that we make, so all our wheat needs to go straight into millers and bakers. And so the nuts, if we can harvest them green, then that might be really advantageous to us, because also you can have them earlier and you kind of can do different things with them. So it's kind of, we don't have the answer to it yet, but we're looking at kind of loads of options.
I was just going to say, in relation to sort of climate resilience, obviously there's been a lot of sort of interest around agroforestry at the moment, and how we can not just sort of create smaller sort of farming environments for arable systems, but really it's questions for yourself, Alex, is in relation to what you're actually intending to do, what your outcome is in relation to agroforestry. And you're talking about the trees being an additional benefit, a bonus, but looking at climate resilience in relation to arable systems, where do you think this is going to go, and what are your expectations in relation to drought security in relation to your cash crop?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point that I forgot to mention earlier. And there's a brilliant resource that was quite one of my sort of key readings, if you like, when I was looking into the whole system, called Managing the Drought, which is a sort of long paper by the Woodland Trust. And it really goes kind of contrary to what you might initially think. Before I looked into it, I thought, well, the trees are just going to rob all the water. The crops are going to sort of suffer immediately, next to those strips in particular. But the whole thing about evapotranspiration is really interesting. So there are farmers in sort of, southern regions of Europe where they've demonstrated that if you can slow the wind speed down across the arable field, then you don't lose as much of the water that the crops are naturally bringing up through that they're respiring and transpiring. And that sort of stays there a lot more than it would otherwise do if it was just being blown off the top. And then you'd lose all of that moisture. So there's actually, in a sort of strange way, particularly I think if we do the root pruning and force the roots to not be directly competing in the same root zone in the arable crop, there's a brilliant addition that the agroforestry will add to the farm in the form of not losing water. And then we've sort of factored that in a bit with the tree, spacings, so they're not really, really densely packed together. They'll be, so they won't be too hungry. I'm envisaging a sort of dappled light coming through onto the crops, nearby, where the strips are growing. And we've put in a bit of drought tolerance with our tree selection as well. So some of the alders that we've got are Italian alders. And they supposedly love a good hot, dry summer. So we've thought about that from a tree perspective as well, in terms of having trees that actually enjoy, the climate that we might be, yet to live in.
We got time for one more. One more final question. Okay.
Hi, morning all. Ed Wilkinson from McVeigh Parker. Slightly loaded question probably, but every time I look at agroforestry and a lot of other woodland creation, I'm really concerned about the amount of single-use element to that planting that goes on. Obviously, you talked about the stake, the tree guards, the tree ties, which are nearly always plastic. Why would you ever have looked at fencing?
So with our woodland creation that we're also doing, so we've got about 150 acres of that going in. We're going to perimeter fence the farm to keep the deer out, and then cull within the fence. That's the plan, and then not guard the rest of the trees. But the main reason we guard it is so that we can mob graze up to the trees.
From my point of view, there's that's a lot of fencing, sort of 7 kilometres essentially, because I'd not be able to do it around the perimeter. I'd end up doing it round the 6-metre strips. So that's, kind of a lot of up and down, and then it makes the strip a bit more unmanageable because I can't sort of get in there. And, from our point of view, we'd want to ultimately take the fence down as well, because, when we do get livestock, which we don't have just yet, they'll form a really valuable part of the grazing system as well, in terms of shade and shelter and, bringing up additional trace nutrients to form part of the diet.
It is possible to do that and reuse it and lift it, recycle it, repurpose it, and at the same time have a 30-year fence.
Yeah. We could have
it's all
done,
doable.
but our guards are an organically certified cotton with FSC pine resin, and the stakes are sort of UK stakes. So I guess for me, that's all just going to go on a compost heap and end up back on the farm.
Okay. So I guess if everyone could give a big round of applause and say thank you very much for David and Alex. Hopefully it wasn't too arduous and enjoyable. But thank you very much, and see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, John.